Hey everybody, welcome to the after show. My name is George, and today we are joined by our director, Patrick Raitt, the director of the Academy of Insurance. And this is the after show for today's webinar, which was session 7 of our commercial property masterclass. And today's session was causes of loss forms and exclusions. Patrick, welcome to the after show. I mean, even though
Thanks,
me
George.
do this, so I appreciate it. Me welcome you, but that's what's happening. So my pleasure. Today's session was really involved. I feel like every paragraph you could go off on a tangent with every single part of the paragraph, and each could have its own webinar. It's really a complex, I mean, you broke it down very succinctly, each thing, but it's a really, it involved the forms, the exclusions, everything that isn't on the regular form, it's like a chess game. Like one move can turn into dozens of moves and stuff like that. It's really fascinating. What draws you to this session? Like, what do you think is important to impart to people about these forms and exclusions?
Sure. Yeah. And I think the most important things to me are dealing with some of these exclusions that can create quite a giant gap in coverage. We talked a little bit about the ordinance or law exclusion, and how that can make a real issue for an insured. When you repair a building, you're looking at when the loss happens. If the building is half burnt down, the insurance company is going to pay for half the building, but the city may say tear the whole thing down, start over. That money's got to come from somewhere, and if we don't find a way to get it covered on the insurance policy, which it's not as is, then it has to come out of the insured's pocket somehow. Either they've got capital or they've got to raise some money somehow. So that's important to me. Additionally, handling some of the complexities of the additional coverages that are provided by the form collapse and fungus, wet rot, dry rot. Those are probably some of the big items to me.
And I wanted to thank you for not including a slide of the fungus part of the presentation. Really appreciate that. I was wondering what that was going to look like, and blessedly you did not include that, so thank you so much. So one of my favorite things historically, because I know that New England is rich in insurance related history, is that document from MIT that you sometimes put into the webinars. With the first policy, where did you get that document? I've never asked you, and I'm just curious where you procured that piece of history.
Yeah, I had an underwriter friend who collected, or still does, whenever he comes across old insurance policies, he buys them. Actually got that one on eBay, and I got I just photocopied this old document from an insurance policy I've got. I've got a couple of other copies from other policies as well, and some pictures that I took when I was at the Insurance Library Association of Boston as well. I'm fascinated by old policies, so that once I saw it, I had to have it, and I love to pull out that old fire policy from MIT.
Gotcha. Of course, it's fascinating. Just so there's a couple other parts of this that really intrigue me. The broad form, the falling objects, and how the falling objects were separate or separate coverage from other kinds of potentially falling viscera, like the weight of snow and ice, volcanic eruption, the falling, within the initial explosion, even collapse. Can somebody try to get double coverage, like falling objects, and interpret something else as a double falling object, or what's the distinction between some of those things, if you don't mind my asking?
So people can try all kinds of things, right? But the way the policies put together, if it would fall under one item as covered there, it's covered. And the idea is, in particular, on the basic and broad form, we've got to discover, did something that's listed as covered happen? So you mentioned the falling objects, and that's intriguing because I've watched that particular wording change over the years to requiring that the falling object come through the outside of the building somehow in order to provide coverage for the damage it does. Um, and that's kind of that's been an interesting evolution of language, and policy language changes all the time, and year over year policies will change. And so every once in a while you find something new that is tweaked in an important way. Sometimes changes are not quite as important, but
Sure. And the Earth movement paragraph, one of the subsets of that was mine subsidence. Does that come up as a threat much, or is that in a domestic policy? I'm just curious. I mean, is that language? Is that some kind of language? Is like a pre-war kind of thing, meaning World War II, or what's what is that prevalent at all in policies still that
yeah,
it needs to be included in the form?
in some areas there is a real issue with mine subsidence, where they've dug out mines over the years, and now there's a cavern beneath the ground that could very well subside and take the building with it. That then, in those particular states, if I'm remembering correctly, Indiana, Kentucky, maybe West Virginia, um, there is a requirement to get mine subsidence coverage, in particular because it's excluded on the commercial property policy.
There's a few other terms that really intrigue me that I think even just for the interpretation of these or the use of these, people should tune in anyway, because not just for the breadth of knowledge, but agricultural smudging. What is that? I mean, I understand the words, but
Sure.
where would the occasion be where something would be agriculturally smudged?
So think about an area like where I live in Florida, where you may have a crop that is sensitive to the cold, and in the fields there, they would have the smudge pots, and and where they would burn something, often an oil-based thing, in order to create some heat um, so that the crops don't freeze and aren't destroyed by a hard freeze or whatnot. And our what we found on the form is that any smoke related to that is not going to be covered. It's similar to saying, if your building is in an industrial area, and you have a lot of industrial smoke or industrial atmospheric gases, if you will, that there's no coverage for damage related to that as well.
Got it. Okay, thank you. I was just really curious about. I wanted you to elaborate a little more if you could. I had another quick question, and again, the session was really interesting. Not that other things aren't. I'm just saying that you really deep dove, but also skimmed over a really really interesting, multifaceted bunch of topics in terms of the forms and exclusions. We had a panel discussion uh, a month or two ago about the liability of law enforcement, and in where people are protesting, and if a police officer has some kind of damage that they do in the course of enforcing the law, who is responsible? The municipality, the police officer themselves. You had mentioned that military is always excluded on the form, but I know there's talk sometimes of, say, Portland, where there's protesters that I guess could be construed as rioters. If the military were called in and they did some kind of property damage, would there be still an exclusion on that? I mean, I was just curious at your take on that.
Sure, and it's interesting that you put it that way, because I got a question right after the session ended from one of our attendees asking about riot and civil commotion. So let me just see if I can address both these at once. And riot or civil commotion is a covered cause of loss, whether it's on the basic, the broad, or on the special form. And that's damage done by people who are, rioting, and who are not acting, I guess, in a calm, orderly fashion.
A
Um,
civilly obedient way. They're not acting in that way.
right. Yeah. And 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 so you're asking about, should what happens if the National Guard or the military is called in. The war and military action exclusion um, is designed such that it takes us all the way back to, back into the 1800s, when there were different military skirmishes in areas, and it was considered just to be an uninsurable event if the military got involved with taking, damaging property because of a war coming through. Imagine, back during the Civil War, houses not far off the battlefield, that in different parts of our country, that were damaged because of that. There would be an issue with that coverage. And as far as if the military were called in, you could make a case that they were acting in a policing capacity,
Okay.
not a true military operation. So
Okay.
likely would not trigger that war military action exclusion.
Interesting distinction. Yeah, I just was wondering because the words calling in the armed forces or the military are different than regular riot control law enforcement. So I was wondering what your take was on
Sure.
that. But
Yeah.
well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Any parting thoughts on the today's session and how it fits in with the rest of the master class? And I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, so we spent a great deal of time in prior sessions dealing with what's covered property, how is property covered, how in what is property not covered, things like that. What are some additional coverages and optional coverages, things like that. And the causes of loss discussion brings that together, because you've got to have property that's covered, and you've got to have an event that damages that property that's covered, to come together to find out whether or not there's a payable claim at some point. And so this kind of is starting to bring everything full circle, and it plays well into the next session, which will be some selected endorsements. We'll look at some endorsements that expand coverage. We'll look at some endorsements that further restrict coverage, and we'll wrap it all up, hopefully in a nice, neat bow. But I'm finding that there is plenty to talk about with each of these. In fact, there's always something I feel like I've left out, that I could have added in at some point or another.
Yeah, I feel like at some point we should do an all day, cover everything in one shot with an interactive, like a live audience kind of. I mean, people tune in live for the webinars, but just I don't know. I think this warrants this in a more extended setting, if that's conceivable.
It's doable.
All right.
We have the technology.
And so next week's webinar is role of the wholesale agent, given by Richard Faber. And I was wondering if you wanted to mention anything about that webinar next week and what we can expect.
Sure. Yeah. And with that, you're dealing with the wholesale agent as often an agent that's dealing in kind of the E&S realm of insurance. Maybe they are dealing with more retail agents, and they're working together to place a risk. So I think Richard's going to take us a little bit by hand and help us to understand that uh, on a simpler level, and I'm looking forward to it. Richard always does a great job.
Absolutely, I agree. Great. Well, Patrick, thanks so much for taking some time out to do the after show. And on behalf of our director, Patrick Great, I'd just like to say that I'm your obedient servant and host, George. And thanks for tuning in to the webinars. And we look forward to seeing you next week.